Are there anything you particularly want to open up with between yourselves, maybe?
I wondered, when I saw All That Is Solid, there was this Nigerian man standing there with this sword waving around in front of me as a viewer. I was quite intimidated by that. I wondered if it was a staged scene, or you're saying that it is like documentary work, but so what was the situation?
The situation of that was it wasn't staged at all, and in the video you'll note that it cuts in quite abruptly and almost mid-sentence with him, and that's because that was the moment I turned the camera on. He just started yelling at me, and I thought that he probably, whatever he was saying was probably deserved to be recorded. So that was actually totally documentary. I didn't tell him at all what to say, and of course, I mean, I didn't know what he was saying because it's Nigerian Pidgin English. So it looks, I mean, yeah, it might look staged in part because his sword play is so good. I mean, he's able to splash water at me and things, so it looks choreographed, but it was actually as spontaneous as it got. I think the only stage scene in that work is this dance ritual prior to the God of War that they do before they go off to battle, which, there was no battle that day. They just did it for camera. I let them do it as they otherwise would. I asked them if there was anything they wanted to show me, and that's what they wanted to show me. So it came from them as an improvisation. I wasn't really directing any more than, or I wasn't scripting. I do direct as a documentary work, but that was, it was still documentary in this kind of traditional early 20th century documentary ethics of recreating everything, but it wasn't spontaneous. But the sword scene was, the machete. I think the movement also in Echo was one towards something that was much more staged, and that was, I mean, the real kind of difference for me in my mode of production was that it was the first time I really worked with a camera crew and a big apparatus and had a shoot with, different, cinematographer and kind of this kind of major apparatus. And at first, I thought it would be a real relief because it could alleviate the contingencies of documentary making, where you just had to record what you're given. And on the shoot, someone behind the camera crew got hit by a car, and so the shoot had to stop temporarily, and then there was a police car in the middle of the scene, and then there was an ambulance and so on. And so that actually became part of the video as well. Decided that would give the video some sort of narrative structure. It's about danger and death in that way. So the documentary persists even when it was intended to be constructed.
I think that there's another opportunity again, though, isn't there? Ultimately, we are combining our real-time experience as the viewer with a linear recording. And it suggests to me that there's a next stage to the work where we can be taking real-time feeds from many sources. And I'll just kind of ask you the question is, can you foresee a situation where as an artist you've almost completely abandoned authorship? Why that's of particular interest to me as someone who's interested in contemporary art and new media practice, in a sense that that's a very current debate, or an ongoing debate over a 40-year period, about the politics of democratizing media, whole notions around subjectivity, and whether it's actually whether actually we don't need authors. It's a fundamental question around art.
I hadn't thought about it before. My initial reaction is defensive, which is of course not. But I suppose that to a large extent I already concede a lot of authorship. I mean, filmmaking is necessarily a collaborative production, particularly documentary making, where you're collaborating with participants who are improvising. And my next work is to improvise with actors who are their own authors. And I can imagine, I've imagined also doing so live as a performance and not only in video. And so I think it would be, you know, the asymptotically kind of the limit would be a total abandonment, but I don't know what that would look like. I mean, I guess possibly, but I can't imagine that. That's maybe a good challenge.
I think there's something going on. It's like when you're looking at the representation of other people,
yeah,
that if those representations are made really well, and they're sort of beautifully observed, it induces a sense of empathy, and understanding and commonality, which is, you know, it's a really important part of art. But I can also imagine another scenario where you know, technically we're on the point of being able to achieve a sense of collectivity through I was hoping that Olaf might join on here on a kind of scientific note, a sense of collective consciousness.
Right.
And I think your work's a step towards that.
Yeah, when you raise the point of less or loss of authorship, well, two responses. My scientifically maybe a later one, but the first one was that I found when I experienced the work for the first time, how it's installed here, there's a very strong authorship in a way. It maybe resonates with a term that you mentioned of the model viewer. I mean, there's somebody who constructs what our or my participation in the work is. And I felt that very strongly. We have our limits, and they seem to be defined. And I felt it very interesting to explore these limits that you give us in this way. And that's maybe then we can discuss it. But of course, there's also freedom for the literal viewer, I think you call it, who gets to become participant and creator within these limits. And from a scientific point of view, so people like me, they look or they try to understand the biology, the physics, if we want a harder term, or even the computational mechanisms, what creates this self. But it's the self, as my philosophy friends tell me, as a thing doesn't exist. It's an experience. It's not a thing out there in the world, but it's nevertheless it's a range of particular brain mechanisms, and we think that the body is of relevance. How my body right now, moving the hands, sitting here with a leg crossed. So what is it in the brain that represents this? It's a very dynamic, ongoing process, and I think from a neuroscientific point of view, one can link back to this idea of authorship. It's not one thing and one state, and that's the self or consciousness. It's a continuously changing, highly dynamic mechanism that can be probably best described by statistics. So, of course, but that's so different than the daily experience we have of a self, of being just this one thing for many, many years. So I think that, so I think even within science, there is no author for the self in the brain. So the biology, the physics, that will not give us this. For us, the self is constructed by these brain mechanisms and how they interact with other brains. So the social world is the very simple rubber hand illusion shows this. I mean, it's could be the hand of somebody else or the fake hand, and that changes already what my brain perceives as me, or as the limits of my body. So it's a very open border. So even for the self, probably we don't have the authorship we would like to have. And I think I don't know. These for me are issues that I find.
Many of the works that have been commissioned for that space have some form of interaction, if we can use that generalization, which would range from being an instrument which is played through physical movement, And I think really it's going to be really interesting to get your feedback as the people that are the participants or the experiences of the artwork, because it seems actually quite like a ontological experience, which is, and I think that it's somewhere in the sort of play between a new form of work, which is there's an expectation that you are going to interact with it, and ultimately you are confronted with a mirror. Would you like to say something about that? Yeah.
So confronted with the mirror, well, I think like what I can say about that is that like in the past that has interested artists a lot. There are a lot of artists who have been working with mirrors, and Mark has already shown that. I think like what is interesting is that especially at a certain point in time, like I think that was around the 1960s, artists have also been working a lot with like fragmented images of the self, and like what we've seen here up there, like the images that Mark showed weren't like so much these fragmented images, I think, but like I have heard Dan Graham was mentioned. I think he works with fragmented images. Smithson, who else? Yeah, I don't know right now, but
Mark.
Well, I think you know, as long as it's an interaction, there is authorship really, because they're interacting with a work, no matter how minimal, and there is someone beyond that. I think if to minimize authorship, some artists and friends have the work I know most intimately is that of my friends who are interested in kind of relational performances where they construct a structure of social interaction, or sometimes a game where people participate. They still author the situation and the rules, but it feels much more interactive because it's not a singular interaction between themselves and an image or apparatus, whatever that might be, but it's between two people, so it feels even more collaborative because it's multiple rather than binary between the artist or the artwork and the person. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like that's not really. I think that has a limit.
Well, I think we've reached the limit.
Yeah.
And in a sense, this is. I don't know if we've got any media artists in the room, but it's a crisis of media art where it's sort of it has to move beyond its own techno fetishism, so that it's not about physical embodiment. It can't be about physical embodiment. It has to be about the mind. So that, in a sense, there's a lot more interaction going on with the Caravaggio painting.
Right.
So what I'm trying to tease out here, and maybe this is where the audience can help us, is this a new form that's sort of sitting between the ontological and embodied interaction? So on that, perhaps we can have some questions, please. Do we do microphones in this, Leslie?
I think if we just do a little shout.
Okay, so if you can speak fairly loudly so we can record it.
There's a microphone.
There is a microphone,
yeah.
okay, and that's so that it ends up in here. Yes, please, thank you. It doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment, but we'd prefer questions to anybody.
Hello.
There you go.
Hi, I'm Adrian. I'm a poet, but I also work on kind of digital technologies. Very interesting work, and very interesting hearing you talk about it. The thing I kind of, just a very short question, really, Mark, really, is to what extent is the narrative in the work important to you? Because I noticed the spaces upstairs, we walk in at any point during the artwork, whereas obviously the one downstairs is kind of triggered. And so I just wondered Is that important to you?
Yes, but it's funny that you introduce yourself as a poet, because I try to use narrative in a lyrical way, and I look more towards poetic structures than stories. I've often said, people try to, less so now, but there's a discourse about the difference between cinema and video art, and I say it's analogous to the difference between prose and poetry. And just because it's video art or poetry doesn't mean there's no narrative, it just means it's not foremost, And so it's important, a narrative is important to me, but also, the work needs to make sense. And there are implied narratives with the upstairs works. If you kind of, tease out the situations, there are movements, but there's not a plot. And so they're more like vignettes. And the challenge with this work was to even withdraw further from the narrative, which is to have no words at all, and so have an implied narrative that is completely formal. So there are differences in time, there are objects that emerge and reappear. So that's important, but it was important to play with that narrative. And the way I work with narrative in my documentary was to edit out as much of it as possible to let it still let it make sense. Like kind of poets taking out words. And first, take out as much information as possible so it becomes a more universal than a specific situation and not informative or expositional, but then only distill into the essence. I think narrative is unavoidable as long as you have people who are talking, because they need to be subjects who have desires and situations and personalities. But it doesn't need to be structural. And I think the problem with cinema today is that, the predominance of the story and this kind of, every story seems like the same, and they're all about these, cookie cutter heroes, and it's just basically overproduced and over workshop scripts, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. Yeah?
Maybe one just quick follow-up again to link about the self and science and philosophy and so on. Dan Dennett, one of the major philosophies from the US, a very important self that he distinguishes from the embodied self is a narrative self. He calls it sometimes the selfie self, and it's linked to autobiographical memory, but how those life events are narrated, or our brain basically re-represents them and puts them into a stream. So this temporal element and the language element is very important for him for one really high level aspect of the self. So he calls it the narrative self.
But I wonder, do you work with narrative in your research, or is there any kind of, especially kind of linguistic narrative? It can be a visual narrative that is not,
So we're kind of on the opposite side. For the last 10 years, let's say, we've worked really on this, how comes touch, vision, let's say the mirror, the feeling, and the movement, how does it come together? But something that we're moving into the future is cognitive aspects and these narrative aspects. And the fascinating aspect would be, for us, I don't know, but how do these different levels interact? So if I change, let's say, a narrative, and you can tell people, let's say, a certain story, and then see how that affects responses in the experimental setups I presented. Or can we change what bodily information comes, and could that impact narrative aspects of the self? Because the two do communicate, and there are different parts in the brain, let's say, to simplify, but there is communication, of course, going on. So this would be an interesting question for us for the future, to see how narrative and this embodied self, or minimal self, how it has been also called, what's the relationship between them? Because, the Lacan stories and this discovery in the mirror, this is 18 months of age. I mean, it's kind of late before the mirror reflection is not recognized as a playmate, but rather as an image of me. But language, full control of language, and it comes, of course, a lot later, where then these different aspects of self, you mentioned ontology, so in that development of each individual, they're kind of coming in at different levels. So So what you can study, if you're a researcher as a developmental psychologist, even in the adult brain, you can probably try to see what the relationship between these different levels is: narration, cognition, minimal. You can do this probably as well. Yeah.
Mm.
Mark, and kind of Olaf, I suppose. I'm interested really in the relationship between the soundtrack and the visuals, and the difference between upstairs and downstairs, where, as you said, there's no voice. There isn't a narrative coming, or a narrator downstairs. In fact, the narrator's the people speaking in the gallery. And I'd just like interested how you came to make that change between the use of a soundtrack and a kind of the way the visuals morph in Ghosts, and the sense around sound kind of morphs, and how that works with an out-of-body experience. The relationship between the visuals and the audio.
That's a good question. Yeah, the sound was really another interesting formal aspect, because, with documentary work, I've always used sync sound and trying to have a multi-screen installation with different sound sources. The challenge is to prevent it from becoming noise, So synchronicity in a multi-screen video installation is much more difficult in an audio sense than in a video one. What I was actually interested in, I wrote down during Olaf's speech about, I don't know, I wrote somewhere along the line, I wrote words about how the self is an illusion, and there's a synchronization, the illusion is constructed through the synchronization of perception, particularly synchronization of sound and image and touch, something like that. And I think cinema is, and particularly in this work, I was trying to separate the sound and image, first through an echo or a delay in your own live feed, and then a delay in the audio, and then a resynchronization of what you see and what you hear. So both your sound and image are resynchronized in this kind of, you snap and then you see your image snap. So it's trying to affect a kind of disembodiment by using audio to create a sense of dissociation rather than a sense of hyperrealism. I don't know, maybe you have a better idea of what I'm doing.
Well, one thing about sound and what I briefly mentioned about out-of-body experiences, if one goes there and looks, if you have an out-of-body experience, which is a very extremely visual experience of being not where you should be, classically there is no sound. This is a silent experience. And if there is sound, it increases the eeriness, the uncanniness of the sensation, because it comes from below, and so it is congruent with what you see. So there seems to be a complete disembodiment that also includes sound, but it's rare that it is present, and it's kind of a slight sound from a distance that is heard there as well. Again, just one quick comment. So the relationship of sound and words with a narrative self is probably a different one than these images. Maybe the images we see is a more primitive, minimal notion of self that we try to dissociate, again in the research lab, whereas the sound would maybe have more preferential access to these higher level language-based notions. But of course, there are the two levels, right? There's a verbal and a non-verbal sound that could have these effects. Just two comments. Yeah.
Oh, and two quick things about the sound and echo. There's in the silent bit, or there's a bit that sounds silent, and you might feel I used a subsonic. It feels like a drone. It's a 20 hertz that you can't hear. So, but you can feel viscerally. Maybe you can kind of feel this kind of claustrophobia on your ears. It's quite subtle. And I was trying to, give some sort of volume to this to this possible inaudible out-of-body experience that you're talking about. The second thing is, the piece is called Echo, and there is an echo that comes in and out, and that's also a reference to Narcissus. This piece has gone through many titles, working titles, and I went from Narcissus to Narcissus and I go to Echo, actually, because the poets will know that Echo was not the lover of Narcissus, but she was in love with Narcissus and couldn't call out to him, but only could return the last words he spoke, which is where our name for the phenomenon of echo comes from. And then in looking for her is where he finds his own reflection. He hears her voice and instead stumbles upon a pool of water where he sees himself and falls in love with himself instead of her. So that's the sound kind of gave narrative structure or reference to the work.
Just briefly,
Can
go
I
on, you go
ask
first.
a last question to Olaf? Or like a last, I don't know, but I wonder, like, where is that research going to lead you? Is there like a certain aim or something? Like, what is the...
So, yeah, three answers maybe. So one is really I want to understand as much as I can. So this is the scientific basic drive. Know thyself. It's again a very old thing, but having so neuroscience is very technology dependent for many things. Activating those brain region and measuring it, but also stimulating. And the body, we know a lot about the visual system, but the bodily system has been quite neglected. It's like a non-interesting, not maybe linked to fascinating cognition. So I think there is a lot to be done in understanding what represents and how the body is represented and what it means for the self. So it's pure curiosity and which is one answer, short, but was already too long. And then the second one is really we have found out that some of these findings we have can be applied to medicine if you want. So there's pain. So out-of-body experience, for example, if you have one, and you should be in a situation of extreme pain, people feel less pain. It's like an analgesic in a sense. So when we've done few studies in healthy subjects where that simple illusion, or let's say the rubber hand illusion, decreases pain you may feel. And this works in a sense, it's a new form of psychotherapy or cognitive psychotherapy in a way where the virtual reality could be used in a way. So that's a second one. And then a third one is maybe the exploration between the art world and these findings that we have, which is a huge hobby and a huge interest that I have. But and that's what I probably didn't explain well at the end. But I think it could be really an interesting bidirectional way. And this is not really about understanding, but more about creation, which is something that, of course, scientists have a lot of trouble with. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Oh, yes, sir.
Just a question to our neurologist. In the film that you showed of the false hand and the stabbing, I feel that if I were in the position of the subject there and somebody made a violent move like that, my reaction would be virtually exactly the same as the subject in your film. So as a control, how does this affect the interpretation of the experience?
So what do you mean as a control? So what?
Well, since I feel that if I had been in the position of the subject,
you would have done the same.
My reaction would have been very similar. I would have withdrawn the hand behind the curtain. So how do you differentiate? And also, obviously, the stabbing. Surely the subject wouldn't feel an actual piercing of the hand. So how do you interpret?
So what these data suggest? So we don't really have proof, but what the data suggests is that the brain represents this violent act as being directed towards the real body, or we could say that the virtual hand or plastic hand has taken over, at least to some degree, the representation.
even if you dispense with the plastic hand and you just have somebody sitting at a table.
So that was the point I mentioned too briefly. Normally you should have pulled away. Normally the hand you pull away is the one that's closest to the attack, I would assume. But this is not what you saw on the video. On the video, that hand remained.
He had a movement back.
If you, well, yeah, so what he pulls away first is this, and then goes this. Right, so but but this hand was more or less still on the table, and if it would be purely based on spatial and what you can see from there and so on, it's like we would have predicted something else. And then psychologists, well, one does a lot of control experiment. The stroking could not be synchronous, the same attack, and then the response of pulling away or of sweat or fear responses, which is another thing one can measure, would decrease. There's another measurement, no threat at all involved. Where people are simply asked to point with the other hand where their real hand would be with eyes closed, and people do not point here, but they show systematic drifts in hand location towards the fake hand. So there's no threat involved, and one sees that. But what I find astonishing here is, I mean, I've carried this hand around for 45 years. Why after 2 minutes is it immediately shifted, let's say 10 centimeters away from it? And why is this so flexible? And this is maybe a form of ecstasy, and these boundaries of the self and the bodily self are very flexible. However, an out-of-body experience is extremely rare. So it basically suggests a strong flexibility and a constant work that the brain has to do in order to keep this representation more or less stable. And again, this is a conflict I mentioned. We feel, well, at least that's what I do. I don't know about you, for example, but I feel it for me that that I'm more or less the same person. I'm Olaf Blanke today, yesterday, and 10 years ago. At least what I remember from it, it felt more or less the same. Sure, we can be many different selves and so on, but it feels the same. So on these borders, that's something we would like to do research on and understand it better. And we use simple tricks for the moment. But I think once we get to narrative aspects, it gets probably.
Yes, of course, I'm not doubting
Yeah.
the fact of phantom limbs or of the phenomena that you've described, but I'm saying that there are other problems too of dissociating certain reactions from the ones that you attributed them to.
Can you take the microphone, please, Lucy?
Could I ask, in neuroscience, have immersive environments ever been used for things like head injuries for kind of retraining the brain in terms of being able to see, therefore, can you get some of those patterns working again? Or?
That's one of the hopes we have, like that using vision, which is again where we have most expertise and most technology has been developed, use the vision to override pain, to override loss of function, and to create, in one project in patients who are in wheelchairs, who have spinal cord injury, who don't feel their legs, can we use those illusions to make them feel legs again? It's not going to be a normal feeling, but it's maybe it's helpful to feel 10% of what I feel right now on my legs, even if it's fake, and even if the subject knows it's fake. So again, that could be a clinical benefit of this kind of.
But might it eventually? Unfortunately, so much scientific research ends up, at least in my home country, going towards nefarious technology, and I wonder, in this age of drones, creating kind of out-of-body experience would have, military benefit of, RoboCop or some sort of, affiliated body that is not me, that does not feel pain, that I control, that I can use to, subjugate third world peoples or whatever I want to do with it. I wonder if there's an ethical limit to this, that actually pain is good because it prevents us from, doing terrible things as well.
That's clear. I was actually talking to an ex-soldier last night in a taxi who was talking about pain thresholds and his basic training. And that, of course, is that, when those guys, they're getting ready to go to war, all declaring that they've already killed somebody, and they could. We work here at FACT with a group of returning soldiers from Afghanistan, Iraq and Bosnia on a 4-year Paul Hamlin-funded program called Vets in Practice. And it's a massively interesting project. And and also really quite challenging in terms of a long-term relationship with a bunch of guys who are trying to make sense of being back in civilian life. In terms of how much we can further abstract anything in society, not just the militarisation of behaviour, are all absolutely key issues that we need more research into. So yes, I don't know. I'm really interested in this notion that we can you know, basically with using combined accelerometers, GSM, visualization technologies, that we can start to kind of create extensions of our body and create significant biofeedback systems, which is I think it's really interesting in the way that the conversation has gone so far, because we're really actually interested in the kind of the clinical outcomes of this. This is the ones that we're kind of drawn to. But maybe I could ask someone to make a comment or ask a question, and sort of bring it back towards what we might traditionally call the arts. And we probably don't have much more time, so we may have time for a couple more questions. So thank you. Over at the back. Okay. Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to ask the question. What is the question? No pressure. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, just a quick, simple question. I was just wondering how you chose the location for the Echo piece.
Ah, that's a good question.
Where is that place?
That is Bank Intersection in London. Combination of things. My early, in All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, my earliest script of that was to film London City and then, you know, pull it apart with animation. And that persisted. I mean, that became then the Chicago Mercantile Exchange screen in All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, and became something quite different because I wanted to do it specifically about futures and derivatives, but because it was meant to be about futurism and about futures and about the future. But that persisted about trying to visualize capital and pull it apart. And you kind of, the very basic way of visualizing an abstract idea in journalistic documentary is through the guilty building shot. Some documentary journalists will say, if you have an institution, you just show the building, and you know, often it's like some sort of scandal, and they say the guilty building. And so there is this kind of way that architecture can embody ideas, and so these kind of major financial institutions, you see the Bank of England, you see NatWest in there, and so it becomes also a critique of capital, and the alienation I'm trying to affect in the feeling is also something about the alienation of capitalism, which is also a kind of modern or modernist sense of alienation, this, you know, technological world of steel and concrete that is, you know, both making me feel vulnerable in my fragile body, but also shrinking away from me because it's incomprehensible. There's all of that, and then there are very functional production issues, or formal issues of, well, I needed an intersection with lots of different vectors where I can assume that objects will come in and out, traffic, you know. So in order to affect this depth of field illusion with the Hitchcock. And then bank intersection is like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 different streets intersecting at once. And then it was also with Forma, we went scouting different intersections around the City of London. That was the one that made most visual sense. It's also very happily just down the street from Forma. And then, I mean, it's also very interesting because I should plug that I'm introducing a series of short films under the rubric Seen and Unseen next at 1 o'clock, in which I'll show my friend and colleague Zachary Formwalt, you know, was working along similar lines of ways of trying to understand how you can visualize capital, which is, you know, deliberately unrepresentable. He talks, or he has a film in Place of Capital in which he talks about images and representations of this Exchange, the Royal Exchange, which is actually at my back where I filmed. So it's not in this shot, but it's right in front of the Royal Exchange. So maybe it was also a nod to him in some ways, but well, all these different reasons.
You do get that sense of sort of urban alienation as you're watching it.
I hope so.
At night.
Yeah, and I also wanted to be about traffic. I like the idea of objects that are reduced to silhouettes and bright lights. And I'm also, and not this weekend, but I'll show eventually Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song within the context of this, and that has this extended way in which the whole narrative becomes abstracted because the hero is running down the street and all the objects become silhouettes and lights, and it's just a world of kind of weird shapes that shimmer. Yeah.
Could I just say something? Sure. I'd just like to ask everyone, if you are going to go into the installation today, we've given you all an evaluation form, and we are working with Olaf and Maria in the lab and the Wellcome Trust, and we'd really appreciate you filling in the form and also giving us your names and email addresses so we can, if you like, we can send you documentation from the symposium, and we're hoping to produce a catalogue at a later date that will have some of the talks and presentations that happened here, but also by other historians, psychologists, philosophers. Yeah, that's all.
Can we have a round of applause for the speakers, please?